beneath a blazing sun that burned the horizon into shimmering gold, a solitary rider paused upon the endless red plain. The wind sighed through the spinifex grass, carrying the dry scent of dust and ironstone. Ahead stretched a land without end, vast, silent, and ancient beyond imagining. This was the Australian interior, a continent's beating heart, unmapped and mysterious, where rivers vanished into sand and mirages blurred the line between earth and sky. In the year 1843, as the British Empire's reach extended across oceans and continents, one man set his compass toward this great unknown. Henry Thornton, surveyor, explorer, and mathematician, was no soldier of conquest, but a soldier of measurement. With only his theodolite, a handful of weary companions, and the unyielding will of discovery, he ventured into a world few Europeans had ever seen. Every dawn began the same, the rising sun casting long shadows over red dunes, the flicker of a campfire dying into smoke, the click of compass needles trembling with magnetic defiance. To chart this vastness was to wrestle with the earth itself, a land that refused to yield its secrets easily. The maps of his age showed the heart of Australia as blank parchment, terra incognita. But to Thornton, that emptiness was an invitation. From the coastal outposts of New South Wales to the scorched interior, he moved like a thread of reason through chaos. His mission was not glory, it was truth. Where others saw desolation, he saw a hidden order. Dry creeks tracing invisible rivers, termite mounds marking soil fertility, celestial bearings aligning with ridge lines. To him, the landscape spoke a language written in geometry and time. Yet, for all his precision, the desert tested his humanity. Heat shimmered like fire through his lenses, ink dried before it touched the paper, and camels fell in the dust beside their tracks. Nights brought no comfort, only the cold breath of the Outback and the haunting cry of distant dingoes echoing through the stone hills. But Thornton pressed on, driven by a faith that knowledge itself was worth the suffering. He would later write that the land's silence holds more truth than any library in London. It was here, in this silence, that the boundaries of empire met the infinite patience of nature. And one man's measurement became an act of devotion. The age of exploration was drawing its final maps. But in Australia, the last great mystery of the British Empire still waited to be revealed. And Henry Thornton would be the man to measure its soul. The year was 1843. From the quiet harbor of Sydney, Henry Thornton's expedition began. A modest procession of pack horses, survey instruments, and men hardened by the frontier. There was no cheering crowd, no ceremony, only the salt breeze off the Pacific and the faint toll of the port bell. Ahead lay 200 miles of uncertainty, cutting westward toward the sun-scorched heart of Australia, where the known world dissolved into legend. In his journal, Thornton wrote that maps were the bones of empire, yet he sought more than conquest. He sought understanding. Every ridge, riverbed, and rise he traced would become a line of truth across the empire's imagination. The Royal Geographical Society in London had promised him support, though their curiosity carried an undertone of doubt. Could there truly be rivers, mountains, or even fertile plains hidden beyond the endless deserts that explorers like Charles Sturt had called a place God forgot? Thornton was determined to find out. His caravan moved inland through rolling grasslands that shimmered like waves of gold beneath the southern sun. The first weeks were deceptively gentle. Mild winds, open plains, and the sweet scent of eucalyptus drifting through camp at dusk. Aboriginal guides watched from afar, cautious and silent, as the foreign men with instruments and flags traced paths across their ancestral country. Thornton greeted them with respect, offering trade goods and gestures of peace. He knew that without their knowledge, the land would remain mute. By mid-July, the grasslands gave way to red earth and silence. The tracks disappeared beneath dust, and the light itself changed. Harder, whiter, relentless. Water became a memory. Thornton's compass spun strangely at midday, disturbed by the continent's hidden magnetic veins. The men's boots burned through the soles, their lips cracked, and their notebooks were speckled with blood and sweat. Still, each evening by the dying firelight, Thornton drew his bearings, a few measured lines against the void. He mapped dry creeks that wound like veins across the desert, naming them after his patrons in London. Though the Aboriginal guides whispered the older names, Paru, Warrego, Murrumbidgee, each name carried a story of spirits, floods, or ancestral journeys. And as Thornton listened, his perception of the land deepened. This was not a blank space to be conquered, but a living geography, ancient and exact. Weeks turned into months. The Outback devoured men's resolve. One night, a sandstorm descended, a furious wall of wind and dust that swallowed the camp whole. Tents tore like parchment, instruments vanished beneath dunes, and the men clung to their camels as the world turned red and soundless. Thornton later described it as the earth itself rewriting our position. When dawn returned, the land was unrecognizable. Yet he began again, recalibrating, remarking and redrawing, his ink trembling over paper that had nearly become ash. By September, they reached the vast salt plains, a blinding expanse of white under a merciless sky. The air shimmered with heat so intense it bent the horizon. Mirages danced like phantom lakes, luring the desperate toward illusions. The men cursed and wept, but Thornton remained composed, muttering formulas beneath his breath, measuring the curvature of the land against the stars. It was here, under the cold constellations of the southern hemisphere, that he made one of his most profound observations, that Australia's interior, though dry and alien, was not empty. Beneath the salt crust lay ancient riverbeds, remnants of a wetter, greener age. Thornton's maps captured this buried geography with astonishing accuracy. Decades before modern geology would confirm it, he had seen the invisible bones of the continent itself. As October's heat swelled, the expedition neared collapse. Supplies dwindled, animals perished, and one man fell delirious under the sun, never to rise again. Thornton buried him beneath a cairn of stones and marked the spot with a simple cross, writing in his log, "Even here, life leaves its coordinates." At last, after 6 months in the interior, the party turned eastward, leaner, broken, but victorious. The maps they carried were unlike any before, precise, poetic, and painfully earned. Thornton had charted not only the topography of Australia's heart, but the limits of human endurance. In Sydney, when he returned in 1844, his maps were met with awe. Sweeping depictions of river systems, ancient basins, and coastlines refined with mathematical grace. The Royal Geographical Society called his work a triumph of reason over wilderness. But for Thornton, the true triumph was quieter, knowing that beneath every line of ink lay a heartbeat of the land itself. The year was 1845, and across the British Empire, maps were more than tools. They were declarations of control. In London's dimly lit map rooms, aristocrats, naval officers, and scholars gathered around sprawling parchment atlases as if around sacred texts. A single line could determine the fate of nations, redraw territories, or ignite wars. And now, in their hands, lay Henry Thornton's latest creation, a map of the Australian interior that challenged everything. They thought they knew about the southern continent, printed on fine vellum and marked with his precise geometrical script. Thornton's survey of the Central Basin revealed a vast inland depression surrounded by high plateaus and connected by dry riverbeds. It was the first scientific suggestion that the heart of Australia was not simply a barren desert, but a fossilized memory of ancient water, a vanished sea. The Royal Geographical Society was captivated. For the first time, Britain could envision a unified geography of its distant colony. Thornton's map, like all maps before and after, did not just describe, it defined. In London's society circles, Thornton became a quiet legend. Newspapers described him as the man who brought form to the void. Yet behind his reserved demeanor was a man haunted by what he had seen, the fragile beauty of a continent both ancient and alive. He knew that maps were never neutral. Every boundary drawn in ink meant something erased in spirit. He often said to his colleagues, "We chart to understand, but in charting, we change." Meanwhile, in Australia, settlers and surveyors followed in his footsteps. The lands he had mapped, once blank spaces, now bore the weight of roads, fences, and new towns. His coordinates became the scaffolding for expansion. Expeditions inspired by his work pushed deeper inland, toward Cooper Creek, Lake Eyre, and the Simpson Desert, carrying his maps like relics of divine truth. Yet with each new settlement, Aboriginal nations were displaced from their ancestral territories, their place names overwritten by British syllables. The act of mapping, once a pursuit of knowledge, became an instrument of empire. By the late 1840s, Thornton's maps adorned the offices of naval admirals and colonial administrators. His precise renderings of coastlines and interior landmarks allowed the British Navy to coordinate routes and colonial authorities to draft the outlines of new provinces. To them, the Australian continent was no longer a mystery. It was a ledger to be divided, measured, and governed. Thornton watched this unfold with mixed pride and sorrow. His life's work, born from a desire to illuminate, had become a weapon of possession. Still, the mapmaker pressed on. He returned to the field several times, driven by a relentless need to refine his understanding. Each journey pushed further into regions untouched by European eyes. The Flinders Ranges, the arid plains beyond Broken Hill, the dry salt lakes that glittered like mirrors of the sky. He learned to read the land through its silences, its shadows, its faint lines of vegetation. To him, the earth itself was a kind of manuscript, one that required patience and humility to translate. In 1852, Thornton's magnum opus was published in London, The Great Southern Atlas. It was a monumental collection of maps spanning the breadth of Australia, accompanied by essays on geology, climate, and indigenous cartography. Critics called it the Enlightenment reborn under the southern sun. The atlas sold out within weeks, finding its way into universities, royal academies, and explorers' trunks. The world now saw Australia not as a barren periphery, but as a complex, living land, a continent of rivers fossilized by time and mountains older than empires. Yet Thornton's deepest fascination lay not with geography, but with time itself. He believed that every landscape was a palimpsest, written, erased, and rewritten by both nature and human will. In his private letters, he compared the Australian deserts to Europe's ancient cathedrals. Both are vast, both are silent, and both speak of the divine, though in different tongues. But as his fame grew, so too did the empire's hunger. The British government began using his work to justify expansion across the continent's interior, to map, to measure, and ultimately, to claim. Thornton's signature appeared on documents that parceled land to settlers, though he himself had never owned property nor sought wealth. His ink had become imperial. When he returned to London in 1854, his body was frail, his hair silvered by desert light. He presented his final revisions to the Royal Society, a series of topographical charts so precise they could predict seasonal floods and desert winds. One scholar compared his methods to measuring God's geometry. Thornton smiled at the remark, but later wrote in his journal, "I only measured what the land allowed me to see." He died quietly 2 years later, in 1856, surrounded by his maps, rolled, ink-stained, and fragile as the paper they were drawn on. His funeral was modest, attended by a handful of scholars and naval officers. But the maps he left behind continued their journey, carried aboard ships, pinned in classrooms, and folded in explorers' packs. In time, his name faded, eclipsed by later surveyors and the empires that inherited his work. Yet every modern map of Australia, every contour, every boundary, every coordinate carries a trace of his original hand. The continent he unveiled would one day become a nation. But beneath its modern grids and highways, the ghost of Henry Thornton's cartography still lingers, a quiet testament to the man who, in seeking to measure the unknown, captured the soul of a continent. In the decades that followed Henry Thornton's death, the world continued to draw lines of power, of faith, of empire. Yet beneath every new border traced in ink lay the ghost of older names, the ones never written in British archives. Thornton's maps had given shape to the Australian continent, but they had also buried thousands of years of memory beneath Latin lettering and imperial measure. Long before the surveyor's compass, Aboriginal Australia had already been mapped, not with ink, but with song, stone, and sky. For millennia, indigenous nations like the Arrernte, the Pitjantjatjara, the Yolngu, and countless others had walked the land guided by the songlines, sacred pathways woven through landscape and myth. Each hill, waterhole, and star carried a name and a story. The land was both map and memory, a living archive of ancestry and law. To them, the desert was not empty. It was alive with directions sung from one horizon to another. When Thornton's lines crossed these ancient routes, the two systems of knowing, one oral, one geometric, collided. The western grid replaced the flowing paths of the dreaming. Rivers were renamed for British officers. Sacred mountains became coordinates. Thornton never intended this erasure. To him, mapping was reverence, yet his maps became instruments of a colonial order that saw land not as ancestor, but as asset. The knowledge that had endured for 60,000 years, encoded in language, in rhythm, In the flight of birds and the angle of stars was overwritten in a generation. By the 1860s, explorers carrying Thornton's charts were planting flags deep into the interior. His precise triangulations guided expeditions like those of Burke and Wills, who perished in the very deserts Thornton had once described with such awe. Every route, every depot, every river crossing in their logbooks echoed the surveyor's hand. Yet, for indigenous people, these maps were omens, boundaries drawn across dreaming tracks that had never been meant to divide. In London, the empire celebrated progress. Cartography became a science of conquest, the world reduced to measurable certainty. Every new edition of the Great Southern Atlas carried updates, new telegraph routes, mining regions, railways stretching like veins across the continent. Thornton's soft, candlelit sketches had hardened into the machinery of empire. The living map of the earth had become an administrative grid, but far from London's marble halls, the land remembered. In the shimmering heat of the Outback, the bones of lost expeditions lay buried in red sand. Dust drifted over old survey stakes. Even as European names filled the maps, the original stories persisted in whispers and ceremony, unbroken, though unseen. In 1888, the centennial of British settlement, an aged geographer named Arthur Macfarlane published a paper titled On the Works of Henry Thornton, FRGS. He wrote, "Thornton charted not merely geography but possibility, a landscape of empire and imagination. Yet his maps, in seeking to reveal, concealed the truest voice of the land." For the first time, the empire's scholars began to realize that every map was also a mirror, reflecting not the world as it was, but as they chose to see it. Modern historians now look back on Thornton's work with paradox. His precision, his honesty, and his humility remain unmatched. Yet his maps also symbolize a deeper truth, that knowledge and power often walk hand in hand, and that the tools of understanding can become instruments of control. By the turn of the 20th century, the frontiers Thornton had once marked were now connected by telegraph lines and iron rails. Settlers farmed land that had once been sung into existence by Dreamtime lore. Cities rose on territories mapped from his original surveys. Adelaide, Broken Hill, Alice Springs, all built upon coordinates he helped define. The continent he revealed had become a network of towns and trade routes, each named, catalogued, and filed under empire. And yet, somewhere in the heart of that vastness, the silence remained. Thornton's journals spoke of nights when the desert seemed to hum, a sound so faint, so ancient, that he could never decide whether it was the wind or the land itself breathing. Perhaps in those moments, he glimpsed what the indigenous elders already knew, that maps may measure the land, but only stories can truly belong to it. In the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, his maps still rest, delicate, yellowed by centuries, the ink fading like distant constellations. They are kept behind glass now, reverently lit, admired for their artistry. But if one looks closely, beneath the precise lines and Latin notations, faint pencil marks remain, places he could not name, spaces he left blank, mysteries he refused to fill. Those blank spaces are his legacy, the silent acknowledgement of what even the greatest cartographers could not capture. The soul of a continent older than time. The story of Henry Thornton is not merely the story of one man's genius. It is the story of how humanity's hunger to know the world both illuminates and consumes it. His compass pointed toward discovery, but his shadow stretched across worlds unseen. The Outback he once walked remains, its sands shifting, its names reborn, its maps redrawn. And somewhere, perhaps, his spirit still walks beneath those vast skies, tracing the invisible lines between knowledge and wonder. Across the sun-scorched plains of the Australian interior, the ghost of Henry Thornton still walks, not in the flesh, but in the faint pencil strokes that once cut across blank parchment, transforming emptiness into understanding. His lines became lifelines, his bearings, the bones of a continent's memory. Every coordinate he etched was an act of defiance against the tyranny of the unknown. Proof that even in a land of endless horizons, human curiosity knows no horizon at all. For centuries, Australia's vast inland had been a myth, a rumor told through the shimmer of heat. Thornton did not seek conquest or glory. He sought comprehension. His maps were not conquests of empire, but triumphs of patience, precision, and humility before nature's magnitude. Each survey, each triangulated hill or river bend, spoke not just of land measured, but of endurance tested. As the 19th century gave way to modernity, the maps he drew guided railways, settlers, scientists, and dreamers into the red heart of the continent. But long after the compasses stopped spinning and the survey poles were buried by sand, Thornton's vision endured, a reminder that to map the world is to map ourselves. Every line drawn upon the earth is a reflection of our will to understand, to belong, to leave behind something that endures beyond the dust. In the glare of the Australian sun, the spirit of that will still gleams, a quiet brilliance stretching across desert and time, where the measured world meets the immeasurable soul of exploration. For in the end, maps fade, empires fall, and names are lost. But the act of discovery remains eternal. Henry Thornton's journey into the heart of the unknown was not just about charting Australia's interior, it was about charting the human spirit. Vast, unyielding, and forever searching for what lies beyond the horizon. Every map begins as a question, and in the silent heart of a continent once thought empty, Henry Thornton found humanity's most timeless answer, that to explore is to exist.